The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss. Welcome back to our cycle of lectures covering Ravel's orchestration of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. Also, welcome to any of the students who have just signed on to the Audiation 101 course and are checking out some of the other benefits and premiums that occur in this group, such as the advance release of these lectures on Patreon for a couple of months before they are made public on the YouTube channel. Our last lecture left off with Samuel Goldenberg and Schmoyle. Now, after that, in the piano score, there is yet another promenade, and this is probably the most ignored promenade. I think there are a couple of other transcriptions or orchestrations of this piano suite by other composers, and they do just like Ravel in ignoring this particular promenade, just leaving it out, because really, if you were to compare side by side with the first promenade, they're very, very much the same. Not exactly note for note, but it's almost essentially a redundancy, just because of the particular weight and solemnity and celebration and everything else. So it doesn't really add a whole lot to the suite, and in fact, I've actually heard of some pianists leaving this out as well when they perform the piano version of this. So let's follow Ravel's lead and ourselves go to the main topic of today's lecture, Limoges. And this is a town in France of which Hartmann did a painting of the market underneath the title, The Big News. And essentially, this was a painting of women at the market gossiping and creating a big fuss and maybe even arguing. And as you'll see from the artwork that I shared, that is sort of the style of Hartmann, somewhat cartoonish and yet, of course, beautifully rendered. He was really a great artist, but there are still very funny characterizations of these men and women in these pictures, which I believe was costume design and characterizations for a play or an opera. Here, in the music, Mussorgsky has chosen to interpret this with extremely beautiful, light, bustling music that has these wonderful, pointy little accents all throughout. Now, there's a certain simplicity to this music. When you look at it, the accompaniments are just repeated notes a lot of the time, against bustling melodies that also repeat a lot of notes, or use certain predictable patterns. And yet, there is a lot to this. And as you'll see in the orchestration, Ravel manages to deliver some of his most complexly textured music. So I feel that that interpretation has actually influenced the way that pianists interpret this. They tend to bring a lot of color and a lot of life into it, as if maybe drawing upon Ravel's interpretation. So we start off with our little bustling melody here, as I was mentioning before, two just repeated intervals, and this lovely dipping down here. Imagine how this first introductory bar might be interpreted, right? Then the melody takes off, doing little patterns of down a second, up a third, down a second, up a third, and so on, and then has this beautiful arc at the top. And then it gets into this pattern here, which goes right back down to where it was before. This is lovely here, this leap up to a high G flat, kind of cascading downwards. And as it cascades down, it's tracked from below simply by descending harmonies, with this nice little anchoring note in there. Now notice that that function of that anchor continues on here. kind of going back and forth between little accompaniment and melodic phrases in the right hand as the accompaniment and the melody are traded off between either hand. And notice that the trading off is quite intimate, right? You've got F minor thirds here, changing over to E flat minor thirds there, which is just like a whole step away in the left hand, because we're in treble clef with both hands, right? So these hands are just really literally right on top of each other as they're playing. And here is something that would have really appealed to Ravel, I believe. Ravel had a wonderful sense of artifice. And as I've mentioned before, artifice doesn't mean that you are pretending in a bad way or that you're being pretentious or whatever. It's a sense of adding a certain meaningful architecture to the way things are played, or to make the audience believe that they're listening to something that they're really not, or any other number of little devices. In the case of Ravel's earlier works for piano, he often had the hands work in symbolic ways. For instance, putting the pianist in the role of being a ship on a rolling ocean of notes, just barely managing to stay on top. That's one of my favorites. Or having the hands flutter upwards like a flurry of moths under a street light. Here, I think this very, very close bustling and trading off of hands is something that Mussorgsky is meaning to sort of interpret as the hands kind of very closely arguing with each other and kind of jumping on each other's points. That's the way I would interpret it as a recitalist if I were still playing piano. And of course, things climb further and further, after which the accompaniment trading off with the melody just climbs higher and higher. Notice that we're in the key of E flat, sort of once again getting away from all of those multiple sharps that we had before in previous movements. And I love this little dancing trading off. It has a nicely scolding quality, or sort of leapfrogging quality. This is also very cool in here, catching the offbeats within groups of sixteenths with the left hand sort of working its way down jaggedly. Then we go back to the original subject for the first couple of bars. Then in the middle of the second bar, things just leap up to keep things more interesting. And from there, Mussorgsky starts to develop his material. Things that I would be looking out for as an orchestrator would be like this left-hand melody in here, how to interpret that against the accompaniment. If we have the sound of a big full orchestra, but we have a melody sort of in the middle range of the piano, what instrument would be good for that? Would it be good to keep that where it is, to have it rise above the accompaniment? Remember, as an orchestrator, you can adapt anything. And as you'll see in Ravel's orchestration of this, he did quite a bit of adapting with this and changing the register of certain melodies and filling out accompaniments. And I feel that that would be really necessary, because if this were taken exactly as scored, like transcribed, direct from the way that the hands are asked to play the notes at certain pitches, then it would really be more of a chamber-like interpretation, because the hands are so close together for almost the entire first page, right? They very rarely do they leap that far apart, for instance, in moments like right here. Otherwise they tend to be more closely spaced. So if you keep with that close spacing in the middle of the piano, interpreted right onto the orchestra, you are actually not in the greatest place for orchestral timbre. The middle range of the piano, which is where a lot of piano music just starts and ends, as a kind of natural instinct with pianist composers, it's just not very good for the orchestra. The orchestra likes to be bigger and fuller, right? And especially in a piece like this, where there's a certain amount of force implied and activity and bustling, right? To keep things very discreet and centered in the orchestral landscape would be kind of a mistake. So we'll catch up with all that in a minute, but let's continue on looking at the piano score. Here, Mussorgsky has decided to develop this whole idea here, hitting a chord and then having a rising motive here against repeated notes and these little sassy comments here, almost like the women in the market gossiping and arguing. So he changes that into a 3/4 phrase. So you've got that bam, da 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 bump, da da bum, da 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 bump, da da dum, right? And as he does, he's really throwing in a lot of little bits and pieces to keep it interesting. And of course, harmonically, he's doing very interesting things. In fact, by the top of the page, you'll notice that he just gave up on marking key signatures at all. Nowadays, a piece like this that had as many fluctuations of harmony wouldn't even have a key signature on it, right? There just kind of is no point. It'd be better to just leave out the key signature and then have the pianist play E flat that is just notated with all of the right accidentals. On the next page, we see those little dancing and arguing and sniping little motives start to intersect and take over the thematic content. Especially here, I feel this is one particular gossip making very, very emphatic points. Now, what are those points? Let's kind of go back and look at the bottom of this page. Mussorgsky wrote a paragraph of nonsensical arguing for his gossips. And loosely translated, it says, "The big news. Mr. de Puissanjou has just retrieved his cow, the fugitive. But the good ladies of Limoges do not quite agree on this subject." In other words, they don't quite agree that that's the big news. "Because Madame de Ramboursac has appropriated a beautiful porcelain denture, while Mr. de Pantaleon always keeps his nose an annoying shade of peony." In other words, sort of hot pink. Mussorgsky apparently wasn't too satisfied with his own sense of humor, so he crossed this out in the original score after having written it in the margin. But it just sort of shows where his head is at with this. He's just imagining extremely silly, unimportant gossip. What do village people find absolutely fascinating and worth arguing over? This is a lovely transitional passage right here, where both hands are playing octaves, and then things pull off as the repeated Ds go into diminuendo, and the left hand descends from there chromatically, and then we're back in the key of E flat major, for whatever that's worth with this many modulations. But notice there's a slight difference here. Instead of starting with two groups of E flat thirds, he starts with a single group of D thirds and then goes to E flat thirds. So he's conscious of developing his material throughout and just adding little touches so everything isn't incredibly repetitive. I actually feel that this movement, as light and fast and almost forgettable as it is in a way Mussorgsky's height of craft. I feel he put everything he had into this about what he knew about harmony and shaping phrases and piano technique. It takes a hugely supple wrist to play this. It's almost like playing The Earl King by Schubert. It's got that same sense of very, very fast, precise, repeated left hand and right hand notes. So we're back to this idea with a few changes here and there. A recap of the material, that same bickering going on, and the sense that the arguing is taking over and becoming fiercer and fiercer. Finally, he ends with this terrifically exciting coda. Notice it says meno mosso, sempre capriccioso, so always capriciously, or solidly capriciously. And it starts off just being a very, very quick back and forth between a left-hand melody and right-hand harmony. But soon the melody starts to express itself in the harmony as the chords are repositioned in this particular beam group. Now here we have a little bit of very welcome counterpoint with the melody descending and the top of the chords ascending. Now this is repeated in its entirety. Then here we get almost perfect tracking of the melody in the left hand and the chords following the melody in the right hand with a couple little changes. Then it just gets more and more excited as things ascend all the way up to this point, and then attaches immediately to the catacombs, which we'll check out in the next lecture. Let's listen to the entire original piano version, and then we'll check out Ravel's orchestration of this really, really fun movement. Before we dive into analyzing the orchestration, as usual, let's take a look at the orchestra. So we've got a fairly standard layout here of winds. We've got 2 flutes plus piccolo, 2 oboes plus English horn, 2 clarinets, no bass clarinet, and 2 bassoons, no contrabassoon. So by taking out those 2 lower instruments, we are definitely keeping things light all the way through, although bass clarinet can be fairly light as well. It's just not needed in this vision of texture that Ravel has got. 4 horns in F, 2 trumpets in C, then our battery here is composed of triangle, snare drum, cymbals, timpani, celesta, and harp. Now, it's a question of whether or not celesta is really what Ravel has got in mind, because even though we've got it marked here, celesta here and there, as we proceed through here, we've also got jeu de timbre, which is sort of a keyed glockenspiel. But it isn't really mentioned on that first page. If we go back to it, it's actually nowhere. So perhaps the celesta part is really intended to be jeu de timbre, just kind of trading off between the actual celesta keyboard and the jeu de timbre keyboard. It's up to the percussion section to decide that. It doesn't make a huge difference in terms of the dynamic balance and the timbre, but purists will probably want to have the keyed glockenspiel next to the celesta and have the player play them both. Then we've got harp. Now notice how our harp is tuned all in flats. And that is because there are just so many flats in this piece that it's easier for the harpist just to think in all flats and actually add naturals here and there as needed. Then, of course, we've just got our regular string section, lots of little divisi here and there, but easily manageable. Now let's focus on the orchestration. So that intro bar is interpreted by horns and pizzicato middle strings. Right, so you've got the emphasis, pluck, 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 dying away, along with the horns. Notice how Ravel here is giving the fifths and the sevenths to first and second, and then an atu note on this written D, actually sounding G. And that is a way better way of orchestrating this than to have, say, the third horn doubling the first, or to have the fourth horn playing the B flat down here to F. It's better to treat the horns as two groups here, rather than as one integrated group, even though it sounds very integrated. We get one little stroke here from the snare drum, and the snare drum will appear here and there, just adding a little bit of emphasis as needed. So the orchestration of the first idea is very, very simple, just by the first violins, and they take the entire melody for the first two bars. The accompaniment, we've got these bustling little measured tremolos. Now here he's giving his players the most comfortable options. So bum, da-da, as doubled by other instruments, right? Da 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 da, right? Da da da, right? So adding all of these together, you get the very smooth bumpa 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 sound from everybody. It's just a way of maximizing the precision of that bustling rhythm. Then here we've got that same pizzicato. I would put in an eighth rest right here and make this into an eighth note, because it's just really no huge benefit, right? It doesn't really do anything, and it's easier for semi-pro players and student players to get lost in a situation like this. Pros will not have a problem, but it's just better to cast the widest net in the simplest way possible and to follow the rules, in my interpretation. Maybe this might make it into Ravel's book of things he should have done better. Notice how the buppo is doubled by the very, very precise staccato double reeds and clarinets, just, hitting the top of the harmony all the way through, right? Bum, 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 bum. We've got this written B flat to E interval, which is the same thing here as A flat to D in the second violins. We just have a coordinated punch on the top note of each of these little bits of harmony. Think down a fifth with this, right? So this is actually going to be a D natural, turning this into a diminished seventh chord. Anyhow, not to get into harmonic analysis too much, but just really showing how this is all put together. And you'll notice that it really slows me down to interpret exactly what's going on in each of these bars, because they are so exquisitely textured, so very, very carefully worked out. All the same, I'll try not to dwell on anything that's too obvious. Now we have pretty much the same approach as before. I love the way that the cellos add this sort of plucked E flat kind of beginning each of these phrases. Just gives it a little bit of push. Once again on this little da-da-da-da-da-da. Just like before, we have clarinets coming in to double, but the first time it was flutes doubling the clarinets. The second time it's oboes. So it just really keeps the texture and the colors varied all the way through. In fact, it's kind of hard to follow this if you are kind of a medium grade score reader, because of the shifting rhythms and the shifting emphasis of what is happening where in the orchestra. It's very easy to get lost, even though this is a very easy bit of common time scoring, right? In terms of its rhythmic layout. So, yeah, but all the same, it's just really easy for it to dazzle you and to throw you off course. Here we've got some big harp chords. Not sure how much they are really going to be heard against this trumpet here. Even mezzo forte, mezzo forte accent on the downbeat, mezzo forte accent on the second beat with the staccato. It's still like the harp is really going to struggle to be heard there. It might almost be worth putting two harps on this part just for a little bit more tone weight. But even at that, it's a little dubious how strong this is really going to be. Lovely high A flat there, descending down. Remember that when we got to this bar, we had these little pedal notes right in the middle with the bustling accompaniment playing higher and lower. Well, that whole higher and lower idea is very hard to sustain exactly because of the way that the hands were crossing each other in exactly the same register. So Ravel wants to avoid that, and he really just wants to get the color, right? It's all about color for Ravel. So he is going to avoid some of the up and down trading off that we saw in the left hand and just try to interpret things more as contrasts in similar registers rather than necessarily having the orchestral instruments dance across each other, right? So, we've got that doubled in oboes and clarinets, just like before, with the flutes coming in over the top of it, right? That creates a really nice effect, and especially with the difference in slurring. This is all smoothly slurred, but the flutes are interpreting this as slurred staccato. So it just gives it a little bit of pep on top. Once again, we're seeing a lot of 19th century scoring ideas in this, sort of from like light opera and ballets and so on, of which Ravel knew a whole lot. That 19th century scoring. He didn't pay a huge homage to it in his own original works, but he does definitely here because of the spirit of what he is evoking, especially in terms of Rimsky-Korsakov. So we have that same relationship here in the doubling, answering the interspersing of the strings playing the accompaniment and the melody, right? And then as far as the accompaniment, during the wind passages, we've got trumpets going yet-ta-ta-ta, and then the horns also, first and third. Going on to the next bar, we're seeing the horns play extremely subtly, actually. Mezzo piano going down to pianissimo, both times, and that is trading off with the second violins. It's so easy to ignore the relationships when you have a little time saver like these double beam measured tremolo markings, right? So the eye will be scanning over this and say, what's going on with the rapid accompaniment for the bassoon line right here, doubled with the cellos? Well, it's right here in the seconds, but it's hard to see. This is why you'll see a score even by a very experienced conductor with circles around certain parts, right? They just want to keep track of where all the elements are. What's very cool about that, though, is that you've got this dun-dun-dun-dun-dun doubled by the oboes from behind. Remember, your doubling does not actually have to have the same exact articulation or note values if you have a background element. It's a really nice touch to have bassoons come in. This is difficult as a just completely cold note, hitting this high A flat right here, but it is a bit of a carryover from the flutes, right? So Ravel knows damn well that this is going to be difficult to hear. So he blends that A flat into the bassoon A flat. And this is actually the first bassoon, right? Because here they go to A2. So first bassoon carrying over on that A flat there, and then they go to octaves here. So very, very nice touch. It's all just deviously worked out, as you can see. Now we're building an energy on the same idea as it climbs higher and higher, and still trading off between cello doubling bassoons, and the same accompaniment strategy with the violins trading off with the horns. But we're adding this bo-dee-da-da-dum with first violins doubled oboes, and here is a case where A2 oboe works really beautifully. It just really gives a beautiful edge to the first violins there. Right, so it's clarinets going over to oboes with the occasional commentary from high flute doubling at the octave and piccolo doubling at the octave here. Cool to throw in clarinet right at the end here and just get really firm sound from this arc here, because we are leading to this squabbling. So it's the first example of the gossips just sort of shouting at each other and arguing over porcelain dentures or whatever. So here we're getting into some very interesting textural stuff. Oboe doubled from above on that high note by flutes, and then the lower note here doubled in the clarinets. Then we've got that sort of middle harmony in there, which is doubled at the octave below by the English horn. And then ba-da-da, that is bassoons plus horns. This is kind of A6, right? So it's A4 horns and A2 bassoons. Just digging into that, and then they are helped out by the cellos. So this is a massive unison right in here. And then, of course, we have got these biting little accents by trumpets, doubled by cymbals and the double stroke on snare drum. Notice that the cymbal stroke is supposed to be secco, right? And not too loud, but just enough of a bite, immediately damped. So the player is going to just damp the cymbals against their chest right after they clash them together slightly. And then, of course, we've got like octaves here. We've got pizzicato triple stops played by alternate groups, divisi groups in the second violins, just to get that big strum, right? And it's almost a percussive effect, really. As much as it is really a harmonic effect. This is also tremendously effective here. The doubling from below of the bottom of this octave by the violas. Now that is answered by like, hey, calm down, everybody. There goes the gendarme. We don't want to be arguing too much. We'll get in trouble. So with this, that phrase, we've got pretty much all the upper winds except for the piccolos helping each other out with either unison or octaves. And actually it ends up in a very delicate place, right? So you'll hear a very good orchestra bringing the energy down. By the time they get to the next beat, they'll be right around mezzo forte. And then they will keep the rest of this very, very cool. And that gives a beautiful, delicate edge. And especially if the trumpets are trying to blend into the seconds and violas rather than just sticking out like a sore thumb, right? If the conductor does their job, they will blend this. They will balance this. Here's a situation where people would possibly obsess over divisi versus double stops and think, oh, well, gee, if the trumpets are playing against the violas, then and the second violins, won't they be too loud? Well, that's part of the conductor's job. This is intended to be played divisi, and in fact, if you do a close-up here, you'll notice that we've got repeated notes, which, however, change the position between the divisi players, right? So you have an F minor third here, played F by the inside players and A flat by the outside players of the section, and then that trades off to the A flat being played by the inside player and the F being played by the outside player. So I don't know how much difference that really makes, but it's fun for the players anyway. So some of this is for the orchestra members as much as it is for the conductor or the audience. Here's another place where I think the harp doesn't really add a whole lot. Doubled harps might work better, but better to leave them in because Ravel asked for them. But perhaps a page in Ravel's book on self-criticism. Now we're back to the same thing as before, with the flutes and the clarinets coming in right there on those last 6 notes. And same thing as before, spread out in the accompaniment between oboes, clarinets, and second violins. Some emphasis from pizzicato there in the violas. But here, when the theme develops, we have got oboes doubling the first violins, and then the wind's completely taking over on the melody, which I think is very cool here. So, doubled clarinets, doubled oboes, doubled flutes, all playing the same thing, and that's a very penetrating sound, almost a wind band type of sound. Very cool how the oboes continue on, doubling the first violins, and that is enough of a trade-off for the melody to stay firm, right? And then we're going to piano subito right on the next beat anyway, right? Then the accompaniment is doubled horns taking over from the second violins, going to piano subito crescendo. This is the most awesome part of this whole particular arrangement, and that is bassoons arcing up to clarinets and then ending with this nice wind chord right here, which is, of course, doubling the second violins going up to the first and seconds and violas in this harmony here. Now here we see this double bar and a rehearsal mark and a change of tonality to not really C major, but just not key signatured, right? So that the instruments can freely modulate wherever they need to. And there doesn't have to be a whole parade of corrections and cautionary accidentals and so on and so forth. So it just makes it really easy right there. Here we're going to the bump, right? Then, do you recall that there were sections where the left hand was playing this beautiful little melody under the right hand going up above? So let's see how Ravel alternates between those two things. Once again, we've got the bassoons doubling the cellos. Then here we've got this very cool idea where the bassoons are doubling first clarinet and then A2 clarinets, and they are alternating and overlapping in between these two little statements are the horns, kind of doing a little rip up here, first and third horn. And that blends really, really well together. Not that adding clarinets to bassoons in unison like this necessarily creates a horn-like sound, but it creates a sound that is complementary to the sound of unison doubled horns. Now this happens 2 times, right? Here we've got the clarinet keeping their little oar in, just to make this flow better, and adding the English horn right here. Now let's talk about the accompaniment throughout these 4 bars. So we start off with that strong punch, right? Punch. Then, as you'll recall, the right hand just basically played repeated intervals. That is given to the violins, and there's just a little touch here at an octave higher of the flutes doubling from above. And then at this punch, the melody is allowed to completely continue what it's doing pretty much unaccompanied. Then we have that continuation. This time the rip up is in the second violins, doubled by the English horn and oboes, which is a very, very thick, pungent line, which makes perfect sense going into this sniping, right? Bumpa, 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 bumpa. I didn't really mention the orchestration of that, but it's very obvious. It's just really the upper winds and no auxiliaries, plus these little diving phrases here in horns. And it really gives a lot of punch to have the horns at the bottom there, plus the occasional biting staccato. So you can see how keeping the variety in here makes this just dance beautifully. Here we're seeing little touches of celesta as well underneath the sniping, and giving it a wonderful color that sort of goes against the nature of what you normally associate with celesta. So these 2 pages are quite enough for us to listen to and study right now. So let's have a listen to all of that with the excellent orchestra, the Thailand Philharmonic, and see how they interpret all of these different changes of color and relationships and contrasts. Really, I feel that this is where the players need to really know their stuff. You know, they need to be listening to where they are in this very complicated landscape. Really, it's like landscape painting. There's like a little touch of orange over here and a little touch of violet and so on. The colors relate to each other, and it's sort of mottled, and yet it all makes sense. It all flows together as one very powerful and sometimes subtle idea. With all that explanation, you can see how really explaining what's going on here, even just breezing through it, is taking a lot of time, and yet it's fascinating. I just feel this is some of Ravel's most subtle and insightful orchestration, and it's worth taking the time. So I wasn't really planning on it at first, but having thought about it and having worked through these lectures, I'm going to have to make this into a two-parter. So it was great to open this can of worms, or open this jewel box, which is a complete mess with pearls and diamonds and rubies and gold pieces and so on, just all scattered together into a beautiful mess. So we will look at that and sort through it and organize it in part 2 for the remainder of this orchestration of Limoges from Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, as orchestrated by Ravel. See you then.